Essential Task 10.3, we are going to describe the general principles of perception. Now, the term perception relates to, as the first box is going to indicate, the processing of sensory information. Occasionally, I leave this essential task to the end of the unit, but so much of our perception from the context of what the College Board anticipates us going over is in relation to vision and visual perception. So we're going to follow up the Vision Essential Task 10.2 with an essential task exclusively on perception and really emphasize visual perception. This essential task is one of the longer ones. It's definitely a horizontal piece of paper looking at it from afar. If this looks like it's too much to fit on a single piece of paper, you could use two different pieces of paper. There are a few portions here where some large pictures make it look a little bit longer than it actually is. There are a few fairly short boxes within this essential task. But nevertheless, in Essential Task 10.3, where you're going to describe the general principles of perception. I'll allow you now to pause the video before proceeding into the concept map. We'll start all the way at the top, as we always do, and briefly define the word perception. The term perception is a term that we use to describe the process of interpreting sensory information. So the emphasis the last essential task and into this one has been vision. So it is the process of interpreting the information that you are looking at. You're looking at, for example, how far away something is it close to you, and a variety of other elements of interpretation. Yes, this can apply to other senses. So for example, when you're hearing sound waves in the environment from your phone, and you sit there and say, this sounds like jazz music, that is the process of perception, the interpretation of, in that case, auditory sensory information. So again, we're really going to emphasize visual perception in this essential task, but the perception terms apply across the board. You could be sitting there eating and say, wow, this really tastes like something sweet. Well, that is an element of perception. That is the processing and interpretation of the sensory information, in that case, related to what you're eating. Zooming back out, though, we are really going to emphasize visual perception, as you can see here, and talk about some big picture things that influence visual perception, and then, of course, other perception as well. The first is to acknowledge a concept called Gestalt psychology. So this doesn't rise to the level of a color-coded column in front of the class, though you very easily could equate it to something like evolutionary psychology. Gestalt psychology is an early 1900s movement, particularly in the field of perception, that identified a series of what are called Gestalt principles in an attempt to understand why certain visuals always produce very predictable outcomes. And what I mean by that is, when you look at, for example, this portion of the visual, chances are you see the letter G. Although, technically speaking, this portion of the visual are three separate black shapes. It's not actually a complete letter G, but our brain reliably and predictably unifies this into a singular letter G, the same way that when you look at this letter S, it almost looks like there is this continuous bar or rod that extends through each section of the letter S. Well, there actually isn't. Ready? I mean, it's really separate shapes. It's a black shape, a little bit of a white shape, another little white shape, another longer black shape. Technically, it's a bunch of different shapes, but the fact that we unify that and that we continually see the letter S and sort of acknowledge that it looks like a rod is extending through the letter is a byproduct of the Gestalt principles that we're about to identify. So Gestalt psychologists wanted to understand why we predictably organize these visual sensations in the process of perception into these sort of unified wholes, as they would call it. There are a few different Gestalt principles. One of them has sort of a unique name, and I really want to identify that in its own box. Then we're going to kind of just group together the grouping examples of Gestalt principles. And then I'm just going to give you a handout that looks at 5 of them, so you don't have to write it into your concept map. We'll start here with figure ground. Figure ground is this very common example of a Gestalt principle where one image, depending on how you focus on it, could be seen in 2 different ways, depending on what you consider the figure, or what's in front of you, and the ground, the background. So for example, when you look at this image, I'm going to do the one on the right. You could see one of 2 different things. You could see a black cat, or if you sort of flip-flop the white and the black in terms of what's the figure and what's the ground, you could see also a white dolphin jumping out of water, or what kind of looks like it's jumping out of water. The fact that you can alternate between seeing the cat and the whale is a byproduct of alternating between what you consider the figure or what you consider the background. That principle of the alternation between the front and the back is what we call figure ground. The most common example, and they've actually included this on the AP exam, is the cup versus 2 faces looking at each other. You don't need to write the details here. I'm going to give you a handout with this example on it, but this is a classic Gestalt principle. And the principle simply states that what you determine to be the figure or the forefront And what you consider to be the ground or the background dictates what it is that you see. If the white is the foreground, well, then that's going to be a cup. If the white is the background, then it's going to be two faces looking at each other. So it really depends on what you consider the background and what you consider the figure. The other Gestalt set of principles is simply called grouping. They're a collection of principles that try to understand why, when we just first looked at the word Gestalt up here in this box with all of the unique different types of fonts and colors and shading, why are there some very predictable outcomes when somebody looks at that? Well, the first example of a grouping Gestalt principle is proximity. When you look at, in this image down here, the items here in the left top corner, the fact that they're sort of close to each other in proximity makes it so that we pretty readily look at that and consider them grouped together. It's a principle that's used in the development of logos. It's a principle that's used in a lot of graphic design. When objects are placed close, the eye kind of just groups them together as a group, or groups them together as one single whole. The same is true with similarity. If you put shapes that are similar to each other, like these triangles next to each other, our brain pretty reliably and predictably perceives them as some type of group or organized pattern. And that can really be used to emphasize the design in some types of logos and advertising that take advantage of that. This one here, continuity, is really, really common. Technically, there's no white bar that extends through this, but it kind of looks like there is. In each of these, although it's 1, 2, 3, 4 different shapes, it does look very much all grouped together, and it looks like there's some type of continuity between a bar that extends through all of them. The most common one that the College Board cites is this last one. This is a great example. I like to call it 3 Pac-Men looking at each other. Technically, there is no triangle here, and I promise you, if I could zoom in all the way on this, there are no lines right here. As you can see, it's totally white, blank void right here. There's no line right here. I promise, I can zoom in all the way. It's literally just plain white, as you can see. But since there is a shape that we readily identify as a triangle, sort of appearing there, our brain is basically closing it off so that when you look at this, it's hard not to see a triangle. That's the Gestalt principle of closure. Even though the object is incomplete or not completely enclosed, our brain sort of predictably does it for us. We call that phenomenon closure. Whether it's proximity, similarity, continuity, or closure, these are the Gestalt grouping principles. And when we combine that with figure ground, we have the 5 very predictable and very reliable outcomes when we're perceiving, evaluating the sensory inputs that we're receiving. These most often come up in the real world, again, when we're looking at something like logos and other forms of graphic design. The other pretty reliable element of visual perception that we can see basically with everyone, and there's a variety of ways of identifying it, is understanding what's called depth perception. The term depth perception is a term that we use when we're describing the estimation of whether or not an object is close to us or far away from us. That could be from anything from looking over the cliff of a big mountain to determining how far the drop is, to determining how far a baseball is as it's traveling towards you, or a football or a volleyball, to determining how far away the exit is from your car as you're driving along. Those are all examples of depth perception. How far away is an object from you at any given moment? There is a study related to depth perception that I need you to watch. This really short clip down here portrays the very famous visual cliff study. The visual cliff study was done with young children. We're talking infants. They were placed, and you can kind of see it from here, though you'll see it more when you watch the video. They were placed on this special box here and given the opportunity to crawl around. You might notice the red checkered here on the left and then the red checkered here on the right, and then it almost looks like there's a big drop off here in the middle. Well, there's a see-through glass right here, making it so that this is really one flat surface. There is no risk of the baby falling over into this pit down here. It's actually a glass. There's no falling. There's no fear. There's no danger involved here at all. But the question is, if the baby is placed into this box, would the baby crawl across that spot there, or would the baby perceive that, again, evaluate sensory information that we're receiving, as a dip, as a drop-off, and therefore be unwilling to crawl across it? In the study, they even have iterations where the mother or caregiver or father is on the opposite side holding a toy, trying to convince them to cross over this quote-unquote visual cliff. What we see are that babies would be unwilling to cross across the visual cliff because it seems to be the case that depth perception, the ability to determine how far objects are from you, is an innate skill that we're born with. So although this baby is just an infant, and although they've likely not had to fall off of something in their life to determine this, they know that this, in theory, is dangerous. They're unaware that it's actually just a safe glass, but they know that that type of drop off would be dangerous even as an infant, only a few months old. Zooming back out, there are some additional elements related to depth perception that we need to talk about. The first are monocular cues. So I'm going to print out and hand you this document so you don't have to copy them down. But there are a series of what we call monocular cues that we use to determine how far objects are away from us, and they all technically only work or only need to work with one eye. If you have two functional eyes, they work just fine. But you could theoretically have an eye patch on or damage one eye or have a non-functional eye, and these would all still work. You do not need both eyes for any of these to work. So we call them monocular cues, mono meaning just one. That might sound weird, but it's pretty common for the College Board to ask a question where it says, how will Bob determine the distance of one object from another if one of his eyes is damaged or patched? And then you would be looking for one of these monocular cue examples. So just to give you some sense of what these are, the first really common one, and you see a lot of these in artwork, it's really a good way of determining how a 2D image, piece of artwork or something that you're drawing or a painting, can actually still portray depth, distance, although it's a flat two-dimensional surface. Linear perspective is a good example of one. The lower portion of this visual looks closer because of the sort of continuing nature of the lines, the same way a road works. That's a very common example of a monocular cue. These parallel lines look like they're converging in the distance, the same way that a road does. And as a result, even though this is a two-dimensional flat visual, we perceive, again, the processing of sensory information, as this region being closer. Motion parallax, sometimes called relative motion. You'll notice in the document that I provide you, I'll actually have a synonym name of relative motion as well. But objects that are closer to us are perceived as moving faster than objects that are further away from us, particularly if it's an object that we anticipate to be moving, like this clearly moving vehicle. As a result of the fact that we know that it moves, it's going to be perceived to be closer than some of the other objects in the distance. Like, for example, what seems closer, this car or this tree? Well, the fact that the car is perceived as moving makes it such that it seems closer than the tree in the background. Interposition is a really simple one. Which of these looks closer? Well, it's the one all the way to the left. Why does it just perceive as closer? Because it's overlapping another one. Now, yes, the size matters a little bit too, but even if these were all exactly the same size, the fact that we can see the full one on the left in its entirety and that it's blocking some portion of the others, like the back legs, for example, makes it so that we perceive the one furthest to the left as closer. Relative size is really simple. I know these are technically scattered all throughout the visual, but if these were all just lined up, the fact that the 8-ball is the largest in terms of our field of vision, it's perceived as closer because we know pool balls are all the same size. We know each of these, in theory, if lined up next to each other, would all be the same size, but that's simply not the case in this visual. This green one far into the back versus the 8-ball are two very different sizes, at least on this two-dimensional visual. And as a result, we perceive this 8-ball as being closer than some of the balls here in the background, or the white furthest to the back right corner. Relative height is another one that we can see a lot in artwork. It seems to be the case that where distant objects are seen to be smaller and higher in relation to items that are closer, what that essentially means is, when you look at this particular one, objects in the distance that are really small, whether it's the little house or anything, like, for example, almost looks like there might be some boats here in the background, they are perceived to be smaller and are typically higher up in relation to objects that are closer. Like, for example, the boat here is smaller and lower in the screen than maybe perhaps what looks like a pair of boats back here. So there are a few different things going on. A little bit of relative size, don't get me wrong, but also this height on which the images appear on the visual can also contribute to that too. Images that are lower, or parts of the screen that are lower, or parts of the painting that are lower on the screen itself, can be perceived as closer than off into the distance. And it doesn't necessarily need to be in the context of linear perspective. Texture gradient, very simply put, the bottom, particularly of this visual here, is much more crisp and clear. The further you get back, the more blurry it gets. That is another great indicator of whether or not an object is close or far away in terms of distance. Objects that are closer are obviously going to have higher sharpness and higher acuity, as opposed to objects that are in the distance. In this case, it pertains to the details of the flowers. The last one is light and shadow. The tip here at the top here looks like illuminated by some type of light. As a result, we perceive this part of the visual to be closer than somewhere perhaps down here. We know sort of the way geographically light would hit some of these objects that this must be closer to us. It must be the peak top. Although on a two-dimensional picture, right? There's really no way of perceiving depth in a two-dimensional picture necessarily. It's all just how we perceive it, right? It is just a two-dimensional picture. But if this were the real world, we would know that this is closer to us than sort of this back right corner. So those are the monocular cues. Those seem a little bit monotonous, but honestly, their names suggest exactly what they are. And once I give you the handout, some of those are a little bit easier to understand. The ones that the College Board ask about more often, and the ones that the College Board might ask about in the context of an FRQ, are the binocular cues. The binocular cues are depth perception cues that actually require both eyes to be functional. If one eye is damaged or one eye is not functioning properly, these would simply not work. So that's a really important point and a type of question the College Board has used in the past. The word BI or bi equals 2, so you can very easily differentiate binocular from monocular because bi requires 2 functional eyes and monocular requires only 1 functional eye. The first binocular cue is called retinal disparity. Retinal disparity accepts and acknowledges the idea that each of your 2 eyes gets a slightly different view on everything that you look at. What I mean by that is, even if an object is really close in front of you, like let's say this marker, my right eye gets a slightly different angle than my left eye. What ultimately ends up happening is the brain takes both what the left eye is telling it and the right eye is telling it, kind of combines it together so that you only see one clear picture. If you've ever done that thing where you hold down one eye and you look at an object and then just alternate what eye is open, you'll actually sort of see objects shift just a little bit in your line of vision. And then once you open both eyes, it kind of recalibrates back into the middle. So if one eye is open, it might be here. Another eye open, it might be here. When you actually open both eyes, it kind of hits right back in the middle. That's exactly how our vision works. Well, when an object is really close in front of us, I'm talking really, really close, each eye gets a really different angle on it. And as a result of that really significant disparity in terms of what each retina is receiving, again, light reflected off of this marker enters my pupil and hits my retina. Because each of my eyes is receiving a very different angle, my brain is able to evaluate that difference and determine that the object must be right in front of my face. If an object is really far in the distance, I'm talking all the way across the room, even though it doesn't really seem that far relatively speaking, but let's just say for the sake of this example, across the room, my eyes basically get the exact same angle because my eyes are way more straightforward at that point. And as a result, my brain can perceive that object as must being far away simply because of the fact that both of my retinas are getting more or less the same image. So if you're playing football and your quarterback throws the ball and they're 35 yards away and you can see the ball in the air, from that point, your brain is able to determine that object is far away because each eye is basically getting the same angle on the football. The closer the football gets, the more your eyes get different angles on the football, the bigger the disparity, each of the angles that your eye receives. And as a result, your brain is able to interpret through the process of perception that the object must be closer until you actually ultimately can catch it. The same would be true with anything from exit signs to footballs to anything in between. We call this concept retinal disparity, that each eye gets a slightly different view, slightly different angle on anything that you're looking at. Our brain is responsible for combining those 2 images. But in doing so, our brain is also able to determine how far away an object is, because if you get 2 very different images, the object must be right in front of you because your eyes get such different angles. If the object's really far away, you're basically going to get the same image for each retina, and as a result, your brain can interpret that the object is, in fact, really far away. A little bit of an interesting mnemonic here, or demo rather. To do this, what you need to do is hold your fingers about a centimeter or so apart, just like I am doing. Not touching, but a centimeter or so apart. Line them up right below your line of vision, and I want you to stare at something off into the distance. So if you're in your room, just look at the opposite side of the room. If you're in the classroom, same deal. If you're outside, same idea. Look at something often and focus on it. Whether it's your doorknob or whatever it might be, alarm clock, just focus on it. If you do this properly, you're going to find this phenomenon where it almost looks like there's a finger sausage floating in the middle of the air, where it looks like the beginning, or rather the end of both of your fingers combined into this little floating sausage that's not actually there. But if done properly, you're going to notice it. The reason that I'm asking you to do this is once it starts to float, if you extend your arms out further and further and further, you'll actually notice the size of the finger sausage gets smaller and smaller and smaller. The reason is the further out your fingers get, the more similar your brain is receiving messages about what it is that you're looking at. When your finger sausage is right in front of your face, each of your retinas is getting a very different angle on your fingertips, and as a result, the sausage is perceived as larger, allowing your brain to determine the fact that the object must be right in front of your face. Again, big disparity, object is close. Small disparity, object is far away. Continuing onward, the other binocular cue is called convergence. This one's kind of straightforward in what it's articulating, but it is important to note that we have a technical word for it. When an object is right in front of our face and we look at it, our eyes have to literally tilt inward in order to see it, right? It's right in front of your face. If an object is really far away and you look straight ahead while driving, your eyes are literally straight ahead. That inward tilt of your eyes is actually another way that our brain determines how far an object is from us. If our brain interprets the fact that we had to tilt our eyes inward, well, that must mean that the object we're looking at is close to us. If our eyes are straight ahead and we never tilted them inward, our brain is able to determine the fact that the object is far away. And the closer, let's say, the exit sign gets, the more your eyes are going to tilt inward to focus on it. That way, your brain can interpret exactly how far away that object is. We call that tilting inward of your eyes, in accordance with how far an object is away from you, convergence. As a mnemonic, I look at the word convergence and I really emphasize that letter V. To me, that letter V almost creates this V shape where your eyes are tilting inward and focusing on that singular object. And as I just alluded to, the more your eyes tilt inward, the closer an object is from you. As your eyes tilt further out, back to sort of straight alignment, you know the object that you're looking at is really far away. The last part of today's essential task is to talk about the influences on perception. So again, this essential task is following the vision essential task. So a lot of the examples I'm going to give are in the context of vision. Unlike that first segment that was all about vision, these terms can be applied to way more than just our sense of vision. We can apply these to hearing, vision, virtually all of our senses. First one to talk about, though, is what we call perceptual set. The perceptual set concept tries to articulate why two people experiencing the exact same sensory information can conclude that they've seen two very different things. And it seems to be the case that one person might be very biased towards seeing something in the way that is in accordance with their prior beliefs or desires. This concept explains why two people can look up at the clouds. One person could see faces and one person could see nothing at all. The person who sees faces just might be biased in wanting to see faces in the clouds. Two people could look at a variety of just ambiguous random stimuli, whether it's the clouds or something else, and one person could see the face of somebody famous and another person could look at you like you're crazy. Like you actually see something in this jumbled cloud or in this, sometimes people do things like, look at this piece of toast. It looks like a famous person. Well, same idea. You actually see a human being when looking at the way this toast is burned, while another person might look at it and say, I have no idea what you're talking about. The difference between that is it's technically the same sensory information, but if you're biased towards seeing something that you want to see, you're exhibiting what's called the perceptual set. This happens in sports all the time. You and a fan from an opposing team could look at the exact same play and one person could say, I saw a penalty, while the other person says, I saw nothing at all. And you both could be sitting there receiving the exact same sensory information and come to two very different conclusions. What it is that you perceive in that example really is a byproduct of how biased you are towards that scenario. If you are a fan of one team, you're definitely going to think it's a penalty. If you're a fan of the other team, you might think that the play was totally reasonable and fine. It's all a byproduct of your bias. The best example of this is backmasking. It's somewhat unlikely, though they actually have referenced backmasking before. Backmasking is when you listen to a song backwards. Some people claim to be able to hear very diabolical messages in songs played backwards. What I'm going to do is close your eyes and listen to this song. Chances are you're not going to notice anything. Then I want you to open your eyes and play it again and read the supposed lyrics. You might be surprised about how you went from hearing absolutely nothing at all to actually hearing something. That's a byproduct of perceptual set. Once I made you biased towards hearing these diabolical messages, you're actually way more likely to be able to perceive them. Sometimes this can relate to priming. We're not going to be able to do sort of this demo through YouTube or through what we're doing right now. But sometimes, depending on the circumstances, you might experience priming where a web of associations has been activated, sometimes really without your awareness. And then I could show you a picture like this, and some of you might look at this and say, that's a duck, while others might look at this and say, that's a rabbit. Well, what happens if an hour before class, you watched Bugs Bunny. Unknowingly, the fact that you recently saw a rabbit might make it way more likely that you look at this and see a rabbit. Or what if before class you watched the Mighty Ducks, the old Mighty Duck hockey movies, if you've ever seen any of those? Well, that's a movie about ducks. Ducks might be readily on your mind. Or maybe you went to the library and read some type of duck fairy tales to kids, whatever it might be. You just interacted recently with ducks. You might look at this and see a duck way more likely than you would be to see a rabbit. It really depends on what the most recent thing is that you saw. That example, assuming that you recently saw something related to a duck or to a rabbit, would prime you or activate that web of association ahead of time, and it might bias which of the two you actually ultimately end up seeing. Otherwise, it really is kind of random what you end up seeing, a duck or a rabbit. To zoom out to the next portion, we have 3 boxes under the category of selective attention before we end with a box on what's called sensory interaction. Selective attention is, in many ways, what it sounds like, and acknowledges the fact that at any given moment, there's about 11 million bits of sensory information in our environment from every possible thing that we could smell, taste, see, hear, etc., touch. But we only really account for about 40 of them at any given moment. And as a result, we need to selectively attend or selectively attend to only a small percentage of those. And what it is that you choose to focus on is a byproduct of selective attention. You could hear somebody maybe get into a car crash and legitimately say, I didn't see you. And more often than not, you might say, well, of course you did. You just weren't paying attention. But it is possible to be looking straight ahead, have something in your field of vision, meaning clearly there, it's not obstructed. Super important. It's not because you're looking down at your phone. It literally is in the line of vision. But for one reason or another, it just happened to not be a sensory input that you really focused on. And as a result, it's there. You really could have seen it, but you never really perceived it. It was there. Your eyes picked it up. It sent it to the brain. But you focused on something else in the environment. You focused on a stop sign or a yield sign. Maybe the music that you're listening to is clouding your ability to focus on other sensory inputs. If you remember back when we first started this unit, we talked about the cocktail party effect, your ability to focus only on a conversation you're having and not the background conversations in the environment that you're in. That's another example of selective attention. You decided to selectively attend to the person in which you're talking to, as opposed to the background noise or potentially eavesdropping on someone around you. That's an example of selective attention. And there are 2 classic cases of selective attention that are really fascinating. For this, you really have to watch the bottom left corner video. It's only about 30 seconds long, but it's really fascinating to see. I'm going to continue from this point, assuming you have paused the video and watched that. But for most people, the vast majority of students that I've ever had, they don't really notice the gorilla costume at the beginning. Why? It is in your field of vision, but you decided to selectively attend to other elements of that visual, like the basketball, for example, and as a result, you fail to consciously perceive and really acknowledge something that is, quite frankly, completely visible. That gorilla was obviously there on the screen the entire time, but we have so much sensory input at any given moment. In this case, a ton of visual, but it also can be auditory and touch and smell and everything else. And as you sit in class, you have all of the clothes that you're wearing that you could theoretically perceive. You have all of the jewelry and watches, and you elected to just not focus on it, focus on just the basketball, and then something that was very much in front of you was just not perceived. The College Board has used this term on an FRQ once in the context of driving and how obviously it would hinder your ability to drive. You could end the scenario with the individual getting into a car crash, but the one area that students sometimes confuse is the fact that if you check your phone and you're looking down at your phone, that's not an example of inattentional blindness, because if you're looking down at your phone, you're obviously not looking at the road, and therefore the car that you're about to hit is not visible. This very much needs to be the case if you actually looking at the road, maybe looking at the stop sign and ignoring the fact that the car in front of you just hit their brakes, and as a result hitting it because technically it was visible, it was in your line of sight, you were not looking down at your phone, but you nevertheless still failed to really consciously perceive it. The other one, and I would like you to watch the clip here. You can watch honestly either of them, but this clip here in the bottom left corner I think is a little bit better. So I'll proceed from this point, assuming you watched it. Change blindness is very similar, except instead of being unable to notice an object at all, change blindness is the idea of being unable to notice some type of change in the environment. If I had the ability to do so and I planned it out a little bit more ahead of time, I may have brought a different tie in today and therefore changed my tie between the last box and this box. Chances are, if I picked another somewhat black or dark tie, you would have no idea that changed unless I brought your attention to it. We call this phenomenon change blindness, where small, minute details in your environment, from the way somebody is wearing their hair to a certain article of clothing to maybe just the exact way that certain elements of the environment were left, you might fail to ever consciously realize that because, again, there's so many sensory inputs to focus on. Are you really processing consciously the color of your teacher's tie? Probably not. And those small, minute details can change, and you might not even ever notice it. I've had many students over the years watch the entirety of this bottom left corner clip and not notice any of those significant changes. And I mean, they changed things from shirt colors to tablecloth colors. They changed a variety of elements in that video, but you're focused on other parts. You're focused on the cards, you're focused on the trick, and you fail to really consciously perceive changes in your environment as a result. We call this phenomenon change blindness, and a lot of tricks from magicians are a byproduct of change blindness. You just can't perceive and really focus on everything. And small, minute things might change right in front of your eyes, and you never really consciously perceive it. The last box to talk about is called sensory interaction, and this term tries to understand why it seems to be the case, and this is very much the case, that one sense seems to influence another sense, and in some cases can even override what another sense is telling you. For example, if you were to watch this bottom left clip, you might notice that the ba sound produced in that clip all of a sudden changes if you close your eyes. To actually understand this, I want you to watch this clip, watch it through, and then watch it with your eyes closed. You might notice something really fascinating happens. It is actually the same auditory sensory input the whole time, but if your eyes are open, you might actually perceive something different. Again, perception is what your brain does with the sensory information. That clip, regardless of if you watch it with your eyes open or closed, is the same raw auditory sensory input. It's the same sound waves entering your ears. If your eyes are open, though, the information that your eyes tell your brain about what it is that you see, in combination with what your ears are telling you, actually produces two very different things. Your perception of what it is that you hear is different depending on if your eyes are open or closed in that clip. And that's a byproduct of sensory interaction. That's specifically called the McGurk effect when it's this vision hearing one. Unlikely to appear on the AP exam. They've never referenced that. But nevertheless, that clip is an example of the McGurk effect. This happens with other things too. An example the College Board is most commonly cited on the AP exam is the interaction between smell and taste. If you have a runny nose and you can't smell anything, ever notice how food doesn't taste like anything? You're like, what's wrong with that? My tongue is fine. My taste buds are fine. Why don't I taste anything? Well, smell is a huge element of eating. A lot of the aspects of eating that matters is the way food smells. If food doesn't smell great, even if it might taste good, you might not enjoy it because you might perceive it as tasting really bad because of the smell. And if you totally inhibit one of your senses, like your sense of smell, it might affect your perception of a food's taste. Your eyes really matter too. Would you find this appealing? These are just brownies, but it obviously looks like a cat's litter box. That doesn't look visually appealing. Even if that tastes totally fine, even if it smells totally fine, your visual sense is really going to override your sense of smell and your sense of taste and make it such that that doesn't look all that appealing.